enjoying this conversation so much, and why I say I think you're very good at what you're doing, because you're not entrenched in a materialist perspective. You're very well acquainted with it, but nor are you entrenched in a non-dual perspective. You're open to both, and that makes for a very open conversation. You've made me say things that I wasn't aware were inside me, so it's a beautiful conversation.
Rupert Spira is one of the most highly requested guests on this channel, and he's a non-dualist teacher of the direct path, which is a method of spiritual self-inquiry. As often happens on this podcast, just when I think that a previous podcast cannot be topped, the guest surprises me, and Rupert Spira is no different. The conversation between him and I, at least I hope he feels it from my end, I definitely felt it from his. It's so loving and so smooth, while touching on a confection of topics such as the nature of reality, what part of our consciousness is shared, what does it even mean to share consciousness, and fourth, which is a project that I'm extremely passionate about, that is, where is science going? What will science of the future look like? This is something that I, at least right now, call abich-gnosis. That is a fusing of both the East and the West's conception of knowledge. For those who are new to this channel, you should know that it's dedicated to exploring theoretical physics and consciousness, particularly around what are called theories of everything. Unlike most of my physics and mathematically oriented brethren, I don't have an aversion to what would be considered to be nonsense or woo. I have the feeling that if innovation is to occur, it's going to come, or at least be heavily informed by the fringe, and the more we do not listen to it, the more we handicap ourselves. Luckily, Rupert Spira is an open-minded, perceptive, sagacious individual who, through decades of internal investigation, found gold, and he's willing to share it. Whether you believe all of his model or not, there's practical advice, and you'll likely find yourself pausing every 10 minutes or so to let what was thought-provokingly said sink in. It's intriguing because there are many truths, many truths that I found in my later years behind the doors that I said I previously would have classified as the insensate ramblings of those who don't wear shoes and who have strings of beads as doors. I'm a bit ashamed of my former obstinate, self-righteous, atheistic self. And so partly these investigations into consciousness from a non-mathematical perspective is partly my admission that my worldview is so incomplete, and I'm not willing to shut the door, at least not with the same intensity and arrogance that I used to, though I wouldn't call myself an atheist or a theist. There are two sponsors of today's podcast. Algo is an end-to-end supply chain optimization software, with software that helps business users optimize sales and operations, planning to avoid stockouts, reduce returns and inventory write-downs, while reducing inventory investment. It's a supply chain AI that drives smart ROI, headed by a bright individual by the name of Amjad Hussain, who's been a huge supporter of the podcast from its early days. The second sponsor is Brilliant. Brilliant illuminates the soul of math, science, and engineering through bite-sized interactive learning experiences. Brilliant's courses explore the laws that shape our world, elevating math and science from something to be feared to a delightful experience of guided discovery. More on them later. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, please do consider going to patreon.com/kurtjaimungal and contributing whatever you can. You can also submit guest requests there and even questions. There's also a crypto address if you're more comfortable there, and PayPal as well. The plan is to have more conversations like this, but with the same quality, the same level of depth. Soon, we'll be hosting Donald Hoffman and Yosha Bach. That's one to look forward to. Next week, I'm speaking to Luis Elizondo, as well as Jeremy Corbell, not together, separately. Those will be an AMA, so feel free to submit your questions to them in the link that I'm going to provide in the description. And in about a week and a half, I'm speaking to Chris Langan, who has the highest IQ recorded in America. He has a cognitive theoretic model of the universe, which is a vast theory of everything, and I've just been dipping my toes into that toe, and it's extremely, well, it's unlike the other theories of everything you've heard. Thank you so much, and enjoy.
Sankat, I'm aware of your podcast. I've dipped into some of your conversations. So I'm aware of your podcast, its subject matter, and of your style, which I always find. I've always felt you're a very very good interviewer, probing and questioning, but not out to prove somebody wrong or to make your own point or to be adversarial. So yes, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. Which podcasts did you watch? Is there one that you particularly
I've just dipped into several, but the ones I've watched at length were Bernardo Kastrup, who's a friend of mine, so and Donald Hoffman, who I don't know so well. I have met him once, and I'm familiar with his work. Not nearly as familiar. I'm very familiar with Bernardo. We see each other, but so those are the ones that I've dipped into a little bit more extensively than the others. But particularly when you invited me onto your podcast, I wanted to just get a little sort of sense of what you do, where you're coming from. So I explored a little bit.
Great. Okay.
I should say, perhaps, Kurt, I'm sure you already know this. I'm not a mathematician or a physicist.
That's fine. Do you mind giving a brief overview as to your philosophy as well as how you arrived at non-dualism and what non-dualism is?
Okay, so a very brief overview of my philosophy would be this, that there is a single reality whose nature is consciousness or awareness, or in traditional religious language, spirit. And it is from this single, infinite and indivisible whole or reality that everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence. And that in a nutshell is the non-dual perspective. How did I arrive at this? As a young child, my mother tells me, as a 7-year-old boy, I said to her once that I considered that everything was God's dream. So that was a very early intuition. God was my simple traditional religious way of describing reality as the dream or the activity of a single infinite aware being. So this was my early childhood intuition. I then, of course, forgot this intuition as I grew up, and it was reawakened again in my mid to late teens when I started exploring these matters again, and I came across the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition in India, which is the classical non-dual, or one of the classical non-dual traditions in India. And I started studying this philosophy and practicing meditation in this tradition really for the next 20 years or so. And after this period, I later met the man Francis Lucille, with whom I spent the next 12 or 13 years deepening my exploration of my own true nature. And during this long period, it took 35 years, the nature of reality just became clearer and clearer to me. So this early childish intuition, I had to forget it, and then I had to find the way back to it through my own explorations and contemplation of the nature of myself.
What's the difference between experience, awareness, and consciousness?
I would say that experience was the activity of awareness or consciousness. First of all, I use the words consciousness and awareness synonymously. Not everybody does, but I do. Experience would be the activity or the movement of consciousness. So the relationship between awareness, the relationship between experience and awareness would be the same relationship as the relationship between the waves and currents in an ocean and the ocean itself. Or to use another analogy, the same relationship between the contents of a movie and the screen. So just as the ocean, or more accurately, the water is the reality of the waves and the currents. The waves and the currents are as such the movement of water, the activity of water, just as a movie could be said to be the activity of the screen within the limits of the metaphor. So experience, and by experience in this context I mean objective experience, would be the activity or the movement of consciousness.
Can you explain what you mean when you say, in ignorance I am something, in understanding I am nothing, in love I am everything?
In ignorance I am nothing. That is, ignorance in this context does not mean stupidity as it does in common parlance. It's a term that I borrow from the Vedantic tradition. It means in the state in which we ignore the ultimate reality, in the state in which we ignore the ultimate reality of ourself as infinite consciousness. That is when we believe and feel ourself to be a temporary, finite person or self, an ego. In that state, I consider myself to be something, a part, a body in which a mind exists.
I have a quick question about that. Are we consciously being ignorant of it? To me, ignorance implies that you know that there's something behind that door, but you don't open it. Whereas being unaware is that you have no idea you even passed the door.
In this sense, ignorance would be a partial, incomplete knowledge of oneself. So we all have a knowledge of ourself, or a sense of being myself. But most people's sense of being myself is mixed with the content of their experience. So whilst everybody has a sense of their self, most people's sense of their self is limited or mixed with or identified with the content of experience. And this gives us a partial or inaccurate view of ourself. This is what is meant by ignorance. So under the influence of ignorance, in other words, when we ignore the reality of ourself, which I would suggest is infinite consciousness, we seem to be something temporary and finite, namely an individual body-mind. So this is what I mean. In ignorance, we seem to be something. Something in this context is a fragment, a person.
I understand. The next is, in understanding, I am nothing.
In understanding, I am nothing. If we then begin to explore what we essentially are, and in order to find what we essentially are, we remove everything from us that is not essential. The essence of anything is the aspect of that thing that cannot be removed from it. So if we remove from ourselves everything that is not essential to us, namely our thoughts, our images, our memories, our activities, our relationships, our feelings, what we end up with is not itself a thing. It is none of the things that we normally believe and feel ourselves to be. It is not a thought. It is not a feeling, it's not a sensation, it's not a perception, it's not an activity, it's not a relationship. So from this point of view, what we could say that what I essentially am is nothing objective. In that sense, in understanding, I am nothing. I am not a thing.
Yes, no thing, literally. But we are awareness, or we are a perspective, or...
We are only no thing from the point of view of the previous statement in which we believed we were something. So in reference to the previous belief, I am something, when we make this deep investigation into our essential nature, we realize, no, I am not something. I am not a thing.
Okay. So to make an analogy, it's like someone who has clothes that say, these clothes are a part of me. That's the first step. That's an ignorance, I am something. Then the second person starts to take away and say, well, I'm still me even without my jacket. I'm still me without my socks. And they realize they're naked. Now I know you're taking nakedness slightly further, but for this analogy, then that person says, okay, in understanding, I realize I am naked or I am nothing. And then we're about to get to the...
That's right. So now, if you were to continue this analogy, you not only take off all your clothes, but you were to continue the exploration and to take off, so to speak, everything that, like your clothes, is not fundamental to you. Take off your thoughts, take off your feelings, take off your perceptions, take off your sensations. What you're left with is pure, non-objective consciousness, pure aware being, which is itself not a thing. It is not a thought or a feeling or a sensation or a perception. So I stated in the negative, it is not a thing, only in reference to the previous thing that I believed myself to be. And then, having recognized what I essentially am is this non-objective consciousness, if I then explore the relationship between what I am with what everything else is, I discover that what I essentially am is the same as what everything else essentially is. In other words, consciousness is not just the essential reality of myself as a person. It is the essential reality of the universe. And this recognition that what we essentially are and what the universe essentially is the same infinite and indivisible whole, is what we call love. In other words, love is the recognition that there are not two things, that there isn't really a separate subject and an object, that we share our being. That's the experience of love or beauty. So that's why the third phrase, in love I am everything. So then we realize that what I essentially am is the reality of everything. In other words, I am not I as a person. It is not I as a person am identified with the universe. It is my essential nature as consciousness is the reality of the universe. So this identity between the individual self and the universal being, it is the experience of love.
Okay, let's say you're speaking to Richard Dawkins, the stereotypical materialist, hard-headed scientist, which comprise some part of our audience, but mainly we have people who are extremely open, and I'm grateful for that. But there are some people who say anytime someone talks about consciousness as fundamental, they don't know what they're talking about. You have to define consciousness. That's not the definition. Oh, you've made the definition of consciousness so wide it applies to everything. So yes, okay, in some way, consciousness is fundamental. What experience or experiment or exercise can you take them and even me through right now that perhaps takes a minute that can help open that door, even if it's just a crack?
Well, let's start with the exploration of the essential nature of ourself. So if you were now to go through the experiment that we described previously, remove from yourself in your imagination, do this thought experiment, remove from yourself your thoughts, because your thoughts are obviously not essential to you. They are continually appearing and disappearing, but you remain intact. You don't feel that a little bit of yourself disappears every time a self...
Should I be sitting? Should I be sitting for this? Should I be sitting down, or it doesn't matter?
No, just stay exactly as you are.
All right, okay. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's all right. So remove your thoughts, or it's not actually necessary to get rid of your thoughts. You can imagine removing your thoughts. They are not essential to you. Imagine removing your feelings. They are obviously not essential to you. Imagine removing your memories. Imagine removing your bodily sensations, the tingling of your face or your hands or your feet. Imagine you're in a sensory deprivation tank. You have no No sights, no sounds, no tastes, no textures, no smells. None of these are essential to you. So you are, to continue the undressing metaphor, you're taking off everything that is superfluous to you. Now what remains?
I would call it something that feels or senses.
Something that feels, something that, could we broaden it and say something that experiences? Or even more accurate, something that knows, and by knows I don't mean conceptually, something that knows or is aware or experiencing.
Right, right. Now, I'm not saying that I was able to get there in its pure form, but I could see myself.
No. You're dead right. Your answer was perfect. That which remains is something that senses, but something that is aware, but without anything to be aware of. Something that experiences without there being anything to experience. Or we could call it pure experiencing without any objective content, or pure knowing, or pure consciousness. Now, can you go further back? Let's continue the undressing. In your actual experience, can you remove consciousness? Can you go further back in your experience than that which knows or is aware?
Right. So what you're getting at right now is an identification between you, so me, and awareness. Because as soon as I say where I'm not aware, then I'm no longer there.
As soon as you say I am not aware, I'm then going to ask you, what is the I who is not aware? What experience could you have of that one in the absence of awareness?
I don't know.
You couldn't have any experience of it because awareness is the prerequisite for experience. So to postulate something prior to awareness is purely conceptual. It is abstract. It cannot be verified in experience because awareness is the prerequisite for experience. So if we're wanting not to talk about abstract philosophy, but if we're wanting to make an experiential exploration of ourself, we have to admit that we can go all the way back to awareness. We can remove everything from ourselves apart from the fact of being aware. And in that sense, if we stay close to the evidence of experience, awareness or consciousness is our essential, irreducible self, if we can call it a self. Now, can I ask you, can we continue the experiment?
Please.
If I were to ask you now, describe the sensations of the soles of your feet. Just pluck a couple of words. Just give us a
tingling.
Tingling, perfect.
And slight pain.
Tingling, painful, okay.
Slight.
Now if I were to...
More warmth, but also
okay.
I feel like my toes are cold.
Perfect. If I were to ask you to describe your thoughts now, just very briefly.
Fleeting.
Okay, that's sufficient.
Fleeting and rapid.
Fleeting and rapid. Perfect. Okay. Now, do the experiment we previously did. Remove everything from yourself that is not essential to yourself, and you remain just with the fact of being aware, without being aware of anything. And tell us about that experience.
Rupert, I'm trying to get there.
No,
I
no,
imagine that I'm not an experienced meditator, and
no,
that's
no, no.
holding me
On the
back.
contrary,
I can see I'm getting to.
Kurt, it's much better. Sorry to interrupt. It's much better if you're not an experienced meditator and you don't have
Okay.
the correct answers.
Okay, great. Maybe I can
So
serve as a
you're,
vessel for some of the people who are similar.
so try again to describe. Try to find words that best describe the pure fact of that which is aware. In other words, what you
Okay.
referred to as your
Okay.
essential, irreducible self. Can you tell us
Okay.
about it?
Yeah, and I can also find imagery, almost like artistic representations. I'll explain that after.
But I want you to describe the actual experience. Like you told us, your toes are tingling, they're cold. Your thoughts are fleeting and rapid. Try to give us words that accurately describe the nature of that which is aware, without referring to anything that you are aware of.
It feels expansive. It feels
Okay, let's just stay with that for a minute.
it.
Expansive. So that is it's vast. It's not tiny. It's not small. It's not contracted.
No, but it's not infinite. It's larger than I
Okay.
am
Oh,
until I start to hear little
okay.
bits of noises, and then it brings me
Try
back.
to tell us about the edge of it, the boundary. You say it's expansive, but it's not infinite. So if you can say from your experience that it's not infinite, you must perceive a boundary to it. Now, remember that you're referring to the fact of being aware without referring to anything that you are aware of. So tell us, what is your experience of a boundary to awareness?
It's difficult to describe because as I try to get to the edges, it's shaky, unsteady, and unresolved. The way that I can make an analogy, it's like if I'm in a forest. I'll just denude the forest of the trees, but you need the trees for this example. And I have a flashlight and I'm trying to find the edge, but it's the edge is beyond the darkness, beyond the purview of the flashlight. So I'm looking for the edge, but I can't see it. But I know that there's an edge to it, or at least I get a feeling that there's an edge to it.
You have a feeling that there's an edge to it. You say, I know there is an edge to it, but you can't actually find the edge. So you don't know there is an edge to it. You believe that there is an edge to it. And your feelings arise in such a way that they support your belief. So your feeling that there is an edge comes from not from your knowledge that there is an edge, but your belief that there is an edge. Now, here,
Okay, so
we're not interested either in feelings or in beliefs. We're interested in truth. And we consider experience to be the test of truth. We're subjective.
Okay.
So go back to your experience of yourself, the experience of being aware or awareness itself, and realize that your knowledge that it has a boundary is not in fact knowledge, it's belief. It's substantiated by your feelings, but your feelings are substantiating a belief, not knowledge. So here we're only interested in knowledge. What knowledge do you have that there is a boundary to awareness, without reference to anything that you are aware of?
So there's a distinction here between feelings and knowledge. Do you mind explicating that for me? Because to me, if I'm just this awareness, I don't know how to dissociate between the two in this form.
Feelings are something that you are aware of. So the question now is not whether feelings have a border or limit or an edge. The question is that which is aware of your feelings. I agree with you, the feelings are limited. For instance, they come and go. They are limited in time. But the question is, what about that which is aware of your feelings? Does that share their limits?
Just give me 10 more seconds. It's hard to say, Rupert. I'm trying. I imagine trying is the opposite of what I should be doing.
It's good.
Which is always the paradox.
Trying is no, but trying is exactly what you should be doing. When you say trying, what you're really doing is you're exploring your experience. You're not just conceptualizing about it. When you're not thinking about, you're in the lab. You're not in the classroom. We're in the classroom. We get the theory. Consciousness is infinite. But no, that gives us. We're open to the possibility, but we want to test that possibility. We want to come out of the classroom. We want to go into the lab and test whether it's true. So now,
yes,
what you call trying is testing the validity of the theory that consciousness may be unlimited. Well, the way to test that is to see in our actual experience. We're not speculating about consciousness. Being conscious or being aware is our experience. We don't need to speculate about it. We can test it because it is our experience. So we are now testing whether or not we have the actual experience of a limit to consciousness. Now, let me just go a little bit further, because I'd like to come back to this experiment because it's really key. What is it in us that could explore the nature of awareness? Whatever.
These are questions you would like me to ponder, or the audience, or
well, yes, I'd like
respond.
to explore with you, and of course for your audience, they can do the experiment with us. I'd like to just ascertain what it is in us that is able to explore the nature of awareness. Now, let me elaborate. Whatever it is that is able to explore the nature of awareness must know awareness. Yes? It must be aware of awareness. We couldn't explore something we are not aware of.
Okay.
Now the question is, what is it that is aware of the fact that we are aware? Is awareness known by another kind of awareness? Or is it you, awareness, that knows that you are aware?
I would say that for me, it's tricky when I say me, when I say I even, but when I say me, I would say that I'm aware of my awareness.
Exactly, perfect. There are not two awarenesses in you, one that is the subject of your exploration and one that is the object.
Well, for me, I don't know if I did it properly, but I was aware of an awareness, and in that awareness, it was as if that outside awareness was the object and I was the subject looking at my own awareness.
If that was the case, the object's awareness that you were looking at would have been some kind of objective experience and would, as such, have had a limit to it. But that's not the case. When we say, I am aware that I am aware, there isn't one I that is aware and another I that is aware that we are aware. It is I, awareness, that is aware that I am aware. In other words, awareness is self-aware.
Okay.
So now, when I ask you, do you have a limit? Do you have any experience of a limit to your awareness? what I'm really doing is asking you awareness. Do you have any actual experience of a limit in yourself, to yourself?
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's that I have some awareness. I'm from a perspective right now. I have experiences, but I'm trying to just forget the experiences that are thoughts and sensations, but look at what's experiencing those thoughts and sensations. Okay, so that is something like a perspective, which we're also calling awareness. Now, can I be aware of my own perspective? Can I be aware of awareness?
Well, if I were to ask you now, Kurt, are you aware? Not what are you aware of? Just a simple question, are you aware? What would you say?
I'd say I'm partially aware, and that I hope I'm aware because I want to be present for you.
Yes, but it is your experience.
I'm
now.
not trying to be.
No,
Yeah, I'm
no,
not trying to be.
But surely it is obvious to you now that you are aware.
Yes. Here's where the reason why I'm hesitating is it's fairly simple. It's that when I'm driving, let's say I'm driving down the highway, there obviously most of that constitutes gaps in memory because we're moving along unconsciously. But then if I was to be tapped on the shoulder at any point and I look back at the previous 5 seconds, I can recall them, but not just recall them, but at least have a feeling that I was conscious during them. Although if you were to tap me 2 minutes later instead of 5 seconds, I wouldn't be able to recall that little 5 second gap, and I would have said that was a lapse in my consciousness. So what constitutes
it was a
me
lapse
consciously
sorry to interrupt, it was a lapse in the content of your consciousness. You didn't have any experience of a lapse in being aware. You were aware all the way through the experience, but there was a gap in what you were aware of.
Okay.
It's like when one movie ends and another movie begins, there is a gap. The gap is not the absence of the screen, it is the absence of the content. You would never say when a movie comes to an end, you don't say the screen has come to an end.
So what you're getting me to do is to identify with the screen or try to get close to the screen rather than what's being projected
You've
onto
already
it.
said, Kurt, as a result of our initial experiment, when I remove everything from myself that is not essential, all that remains is that which experiences or that which is aware. And now I'm trying to push you a little bit further to discover the nature of that which is aware. Let me, and by the way, you're doing very well. I know it doesn't feel like it, but the reason you're having so much difficulty, let me say about that later. But
Sure.
It may not feel like it to you, but it's a very good sign that you're struggling with this so much. When I asked you, tell us about the sensations of the soles of your feet, we didn't discuss it for 15 minutes. You just told me they're cold and tingling. When I asked you about the nature of your thoughts, we didn't debate it for 15 minutes. You just told me they're fleeting and rapid. Now, when I ask you what is the nature of that which is aware, we're still talking about it 20 minutes later. And it's good that we are, because it's not clear to you. The nature of your sensations in your thoughts is absolutely clear to you. The nature of your awareness is not clear to you. That's very good. So that's the beginning. That's the best sign at the beginning of this investigation. I want to just add another analogy here to help you, to possibly help you. Did you? Well, I certainly did as a young child. I lay awake in bed, wondering how far space went on. As someone interested in physics and mathematics, I'm quite sure early on in your life you must have imagined how far space goes on, and you go on, and then you eventually come to what you think is a limit of space, and then you think, but hang on, what's outside that? That must be space also. So and you experience this frustration that you cannot imagine something outside space. You had that feeling, thought as a boy. Yeah. Now, imagine that instead of you exploring the nature of space as something objective, imagine now that space, physical space itself, were conscious. Just for the sake of this thought experiment, imagine the faculty of being aware to physical space, and now imagine that physical space itself were to explore itself. Would it ever find a limit in itself? I'm just talking about the ordinary classical conventional idea of space.
No, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, exactly.
And I keep prefacing this with as far as I can tell,
Yeah,
because often, sorry, just to be clear, often with when we're using language, often there are linguistic tricks that prevent us from seeing truths. So, for example, I can't give an example, but I'm sure you can think of examples. Some examples from math would be the barber's paradox. Who cuts the barber's hair if the barber cuts all those who don't cut their own hair, but everyone's shaved in the town? And then that leads to an investigation in set theory to overcome that. And so there are many times when an answer seemed obviously it's so and so, or obviously it's not so and so, that years, decades, even hundreds of years later, we found out, well, it's not so obvious. The more we investigate it, there are subtleties. So that's why I'm prefacing with, it seems like what you're saying is correct. And my feeling is in accordance with what you're saying, but I don't have the certainty that you do. Perhaps that's because I lack years.
Can we leave it like this? I don't mean leave it like this. Can we agree, at least thus far, that when you explore the experience of being aware, you don't find any limit there. You don't find an edge to the space of awareness, if we can add a space-like quality to it, just for the purposes of this conversation.
Yes. And I would say is that if I try to be aware of not being aware, if I try to get into a place of non-awareness, which is the border of awareness, if such a border existed, I can't, because in order to know it, I would have to be aware of it. And thus, by definition, I'm locked within this realm of awareness. There may exist what's outside awareness. I just don't know it. At least I can't know it as far as I can tell.
You can't know it. Can anybody know it?
If by body you mean another awareness, then I would say no.
Could any kind of a being, embodied or whatever other kinds of beings there may be in reality, could any being know that which exists prior to or in the absence of awareness?
I would say that an aware being, if one is to be a being and synonymize that with being aware, then it would be no, as far as I can tell. But like I said, there are subtleties that decades later we find out, oh, okay, if we considered so and so at the edge case.
Hold on.
So as far as I can tell.
Hold on. You say as far as you can tell, and maybe decades later. But imagine decades later. What kind of, in the absence of awareness, would it be possible to be aware of anything? Can anybody?
I would say no by definition. But
no by again, definition, yes.
Right.
In other words,
I'm couching this, and I'm not trying to be difficult. Rupert,
no, be
please,
difficult. Be difficult, Kurt. Okay. It's good that you're being difficult.
The reason is that let's imagine it's true that there's dead matter, and that's materialism. But let's also imagine that there exists consciousness. So let's imagine a dual existence. Then one may say, well, what's not matter and not consciousness at the same time? Well, there's nothing. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's a third element that has nothing to do with matter or consciousness that can interact with them in some way. That's why I'm saying
Yes.
From the definition, yes.
Yes. But you're starting with the presumption that there may be something outside consciousness which exists alongside consciousness. Now, if we try to find that stuff that exists outside consciousness, in fact, we have been trying to find it for a couple of millennia now. We don't find that stuff. It's an abstract category of experience which nobody has ever or could ever come in contact with.
For those listening, I'll just recapitulate what you said shortly so that the people who maybe tuned in later can understand. When you're saying that we can never know what's outside of, we can never know the dead matter, what you're referring to is that in order, even in the lab, if let's say we're analyzing an electron and someone points to, well, that's not conscious, but you only know of the electron through your own consciousness. Is it something like that? Is that what you're saying? That we can never get to this dead matter, unconscious
But your question implies that there is something called dead matter, albeit that we cannot know. What I'm implying by this line of questioning is, why presume that there is something called dead matter in the first place, whether we can know it or not? Because it is not consistent with experience. And if we want to build a model of reality, why start with an abstract category of experience, namely dead matter, that nobody has ever or could ever experience, and then try to build a model of the one thing we do experience, namely conscious experience, that is apparently derived from the one thing we never experience, which is dead matter. That is convoluted.
Firstly, I'm not saying I presume.
No. I realize.
Camp or the other.
I realize. I understand. You're playing devil's advocate, and
let me give an answer to that. So why presume what we can't know? So that's an epistemological claim, but then you're taking this claim about epistemology that we only have access to a certain set of data points, and those data points are all conscious points. So why would we ever posit a non-conscious data point, given all we've only seen is consciousness? And all we can see is consciousness, or all we can experience is consciousness. Okay, so I'll give you a reason why to posit. This is not necessarily the reason why it is positive, but I'm just telling you. Here's one. We can imagine universes that don't interact with ours, such as in the potential M theory, there are brains. Well, in some flavors of string theory, there's things called D brains, and then they interact, and perhaps when they collide, they create big bangs. And there are other cyclical models of the universe that we can't, that say that universes existed before us and may after us, that we can't actually touch or see. But the reason to play with them, and this is not a reason to assume that they're true, but I'm giving an argument to play with them. The reason to play with them is because what we find is through often convoluted arguments, what we'll see is actually what we thought of as an uninteracting piece is an intimation of that other universe. So for example, even though we can't see the quantum foam, some people talk about the quantum foam at the bottom of, at the Planck scale, even though we can't see that. So why do we think it exists? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One may be that in the early universe, when the Big Bang happened and there was a huge inflation, maybe an imprint of that moment's quantum foam is on the sky. So at this place where we thought we could never get to, even by principle we could never get to, we can theorize what would it be like if that were here. And then thousands of heads of brilliant people coming, using this and playing with it, come to conclusions that say, actually, if we look in this direction, we can see an imprint of so-and-so. Okay, so that's why I'm not saying I believe that there exists matter outside consciousness or consciousness outside matter. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there is a reason to toy with it.
Yes. Kurt, I just want to be clear, I'm not suggesting, or I hope implying, that all there is to reality is the contents, the sum total of each of our finite minds. I would suggest that our finite minds were a very small segment, a narrow cross-section, a localization of the infinite mind, or the one reality, the one consciousness.
Rupert, can I ask you a question about that? I have a source here. Unfortunately, it's just a link, and I can't click a link with a pen. Maybe this will jog your memory. When you were speaking of the infinite nature of consciousness and its oneness, you were saying that it can't be cleaved. There can't be two fundamental consciousnesses because the divide between them would have to be finite. I don't know if this rings a bell, but I was wondering, why is that the case? And I'll give you a mathematical example that you have the flat plane like this screen right here, but imagine it extended to infinity. You can cleave the what's called the R2 plane because this is real. You can cleave the R2 plane with an infinite line. So now you've separated it. So I don't see why a separation necessarily implies a finiteness to create the border.
If consciousness was separate, if it had a limit to it in some dimension, if it had a limit, it would be finite.
And if you see me close my eyes, please, I'm trying to experience what you're saying and not just intellectually deal with it.
With the experiment that we did, you didn't quite go so far as say, yes, in my own experience of myself, there is no limit to my awareness. But you certainly found it very difficult to find any limit. So you went so far as to say, I cannot find a limit to awareness. And if anyone who's listening, or indeed anybody, did the same experiment that we did and understood it and participated, they would come to the same conclusion. Now, if nobody has ever or could ever find a limit to their awareness, why don't we start our model of reality in a way that is consistent with our experience, namely unlimited awareness? That is our experience. That is our primary, fundamental, irreducible experience. Now, if we want to build a model of reality, why don't we start with that which is primary and fundamental in our experience? It's the one given. It's the ontological primitive in our experience. Why don't, and I would suggest that we as finite minds or apparently individual selves are localizations of, or apparent localizations of, this unlimited awareness.
By the way, I agree with you that if one is to take parsimony seriously, one shouldn't posit what exists outside consciousness because all that's within consciousness can explain in the same way. This is Bernardo Kastrup's argument, at least as far as I've heard it.
Yes, so let's explore that further. If we posit the possibility that if we stay close to the evidence of experience, all we can be absolutely certain of is that there is consciousness and its contents or its activity, which we call experience. And it is our experience that consciousness is unlimited. And put these two facts of experience together. Can we build a model of reality that is based only on consciousness and its own activity? Now, take what happens in a dream.